Hey, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of Pete Carroll Was Right, the confusingly named Alabama football live video show. As always, it's Carter, Ben, and Mitch here to talk all things Alabama football with you. Um, okay, we already did a bit of talking about Mississippi State
Yes, we did.
in a impromptu, slightly inebriated celebratory show on Saturday night. Uh,
Which was fun, by the way. We should. I
yeah,
think
it
we should
was.
do that. We should do that more often when
Yeah,
possible after a big win. I think that was good. Sorry you couldn't make it, Mitch, but next time all three of
what's
us.
fun?
Yeah, it was fun. It was fun. Sorry, Carter. I didn't mean to step on your intro.
Yeah. But we'll finish up our thoughts on that game tonight. We'll probably talk some playoff scenarios, and then we are going to totally violate Nick Saban's rules by talking about Auburn some.
Yes.
But yeah, so Mississippi State. What things do we want to talk about that we didn't on Saturday night?
Well, I think that just to sort of let's sort of focus on the idea of how Alabama played overall and how that game went. And I think that one thing that we weren't privy to when we first had the recording on Saturday after the game that we do know now is a little bit of an advanced stats look. So I don't know if somebody wants to kind of go over that just so we can sort of set the stage for how this game actually went. Like what did each team achieve on the field that doesn't necessarily reflect in the final score?
Yeah, so if you look at like if you go to Football Study Hall and look at Alabama's advanced stat profile, you can pull up the advanced stat box score for that game, and some things that stand. So first of all, even not even just looking at the box score, but you look at the stats. Alabama's post-game win expectancy, which is basically like you ignore the score and you look at the advanced stats. And then you compare and you say, like, how efficient were you? How explosive were you? Blah, blah, blah. Turnovers, that sort of thing. And you look at it and say, okay, historically, teams that have done that won the game about X% of the time. And if you look at that for Alabama in this game, the post-game win expectancy was 94%. So judging by the way Alabama performed this game from an advanced stat perspective, like, they would have been expected to win the game a huge percentage of the time. And the expected scoring margin would have been 14 points rather than 7. Because, I mean, Alabama, their overall success rate was, I think, well, I can't find the overall number, but
49%.
49? Okay. Oh, yeah, there we go. 49% to 40% for Mississippi State.
How good is 49%?
It's above average.
Yeah.
I think 40% is like right at average, I think.
Roughly, yeah. So it had like national average rushing is 41%, national average passing is 40%. So they yards per play, they were 7.6 to Mississippi State's 4.7. They got more points per scoring opportunity. They got more. The main thing that was in Mississippi State's favor in this game was the field position. Like, Alabama's field position was terrible in this game, and when it's generally been excellent all year. So I think that's
Yeah, I think only one SEC game did they not have like a field position advantage of like 10 yards or more, and that was against like Tennessee or something random.
Right.
So yeah.
So I guess the upshot here, at least according to the stats, is that Alabama was pretty significantly outplayed them, right? Like, they very much deserved to win.
Yeah.
And that's sort of a context neutral thing. That's sort of a context neutral look at what happened. If we put it in context, it gets even more impressive, right? Like, first of all, Mississippi State's a good team.
Yeah.
Right. What do the stats say about that? What is like S&P Plus?
They are now, after that game, 18th in S&P Plus.
So that's a good team. That's a top 20 team. Not only is it a top 20 team, but it's a top 20 team in their building. Okay. Yep. Now, they haven't lost. Before this game, they hadn't lost in their building this year, right? I think they were undefeated. And that building is for reasons that are both sort of, legitimate and illegitimate, that building is like a really tough place to play.
Yeah.
So Alabama played a good team in a pretty tough environment, and they produced sort of the stats that we discussed previously. The other thing about this game is that they were kind of playing some new guys at some very key positions, and guys that aren't necessarily even healthy themselves, but, you know, are healthy enough to play, more healthy than the guys that aren't playing. And the other thing is that that game was just, at least the first half of that game was just way out of whack. Like things kind of, there was like an odd accumulation of things that happened that created this really disparate time of possession. And, you know, when you get stuff like, you know, that penalty, the leaping penalty on the first punt. Yeah, who knows? So just take that right there. Okay, this is a ridiculously strange, odd penalty for a guy that really, I guess, technically did something wrong, but really didn't really do anything all that wrong.
It's such an odd, like, the reason that rule is in place to prevent guys from, like, it's safety, and it's to prevent guys from leaping over the line.
Yeah.
On you know, punts and field goal attempts. And it wasn't like, you go back and watch that, like, yeah, Irv Smith left his, it was Irv Smith, right?
Yeah, 82. Yeah.
He left his feet, but it was just sort of a, like, it was like a dive at the ball. Like, he's diving through the blocker wall that some teams put out there on punts. And it just, like, it was totally, I guess, I'm sure it was technically, like, by the letter of the rule, a penalty, but it was just such a, like, not what that rule is designed to cover.
Yeah. Now, listen, technically it was the correct call. It was a bullshit, though. And it also, at least, was not the worst call that went against Alabama that game. Another call later in the game that, again, was technically correct on Alex Leatherwood was also bullshit. Ridiculous. Like, the play's not even going on. It's over. Like, who gives a shit whether the guy has a helmet on or not? I don't know. It's ridiculous. Again, by the letter of the law, you know, the officials did the right thing. But anyways, the point, though, that I was trying to make is that, like, you had these odd things that happen. You know, that penalty happened. Mississippi State advances the ball further, I think, across midfield. They ultimately don't score, but they pin Alabama deep. Alabama has to punt out of their own end zone. Mississippi State gets great field position, they score. And it was things like that sort of, and then Alabama happened to score both of their first half touchdowns on extremely quick drives, right? Both of those drives were powered by a huge sort of pass to Calvin Ridley. So you had these things that, like, kind of worked against them that allowed Mississippi State to have the ball for almost the entire first half, and that even extended into the third quarter, where Alabama, I think at the end of the third quarter, I think Mississippi State had the ball for 33 minutes and change, while Alabama had the ball for 11 minutes and change. That math, I think, checks out. Yeah.
Yes.
So, so that would be so they had the ball triple the amount of time that Alabama did in their own building. Yet, with all of those things stacked against Alabama, Alabama still completely dominated the fourth quarter.
Yep.
I mean, completely. Mississippi State had what, maybe 25 yards of total offense in the fourth quarter,
something like that. And I remember the success rate. Alabama's success rate was 60%, and Mississippi State's was 21%.
Yeah, and Alabama must have gotten, I don't know, how many yards do you think Alabama got? Probably somewhere over 150, probably. Right?
It was I think they had 200 yards in the fourth quarter.
Yeah, so that's really, really, really impressive. It might not have, so that might not be reflected in the final score, but I think that when you consider all factors here, I'm curious what you guys think, sort of more generally about this game, but I think that game went pretty well, honestly.
Yeah. Well, I mean, didn't they hold Mississippi State to a season low in yards per carry?
There's another thing, right? All this talk about how, Alabama was terrible against the run. You can run all over Alabama now. They're not the same up front. Well, they're not the same up front, and they have a lot of injuries. But that was Mississippi State's worst rushing output of the entire season. I mean, that's significant, right? I mean, I'm not crazy here. Mitch, what were you going to say? I'm sorry.
No, I just generally, when we were talking this week, I think you asked us, how we would grade this team. And it's if
this game, you mean, right? The team's performance.
And if we had listed, without knowing anything about how Alabama was going to play. I mean, if we knew coming into this game all these things that were going to go against Alabama, the
Right.
weird penalties and the time of possession differences and everything, I mean, you would think Alabama had to play just like their A-plus game, right, to kind of come out there and win.
Sure. Yeah.
And I think we graded it at a B plus, adjusting for injuries, and like I think that says something too, that they could play kind of a B plus game and win this type of game.
And when you have all those things going against you that are sort of outside regular performance, performance sort of correlated things.
I think we'll get into this more later when we talk about there's sort of a resume point that we're going to bring up about Alabama. I think we're going to do that later in the show about how they fare against teams that are not elite. But as a part of that point, which I think relates very specifically to this game, is that I think one of the reasons why people come away from these games saying the things that they are against Alabama. I read literally some columns about there was one that I retweeted specifically to point out like how the expectations have gotten out of hand, which was basically like Alabama's 10-0, but I forget the exact phrasing, but it was basically like they're in big trouble.
Said like Alabama's leaking oil or something.
Leaking oil, that was it.
Worst team since 2010.
Yeah.
Right. So just sort of like absurdly hyperbolic headlines. I think maybe this sort of comes from the fact that because of where the expectations are for Alabama, if they're not going up against an elite team, like a top 6, top 7, top 8 team, like a really, really, really great team, everybody just expects them to beat that team by 40 points. And if they don't beat that team by 40 points, if they play, God forbid, a single close game, all of a sudden they're in huge trouble. But like
they're graded against perfection, essentially.
But playing a top 20 team on the road is a tough game, right? I mean, that is like not an easy situation to play in for any team.
Right.
So I think that like a lot of this stems from the fact that people, like Carter, I think you put it best. They are sort of graded against perfection.
In a way that no other team in the country is.
Right. Exactly. There are totally different standards and totally different rules being applied to Alabama. And it frustrates me because maybe it doesn't frustrate me. Maybe it's a good thing. This maybe it's a good thing that, I mean, we'll get into that when we talk about Auburn, but maybe it's a good thing that people are sort of doubting this team and really like, I mean, when's the last time they were doubted this much?
After they lost Ole Miss,
Georgia, yeah.
Oh, yeah. I mean, that's right. So there's a funny thing we love to talk about is the fact that Alabama was an underdog going into that game in 2015 against Georgia. So I guess that sort of maybe
the infamous Dan Wolken tweet.
Oh, yes.
Feels like if Ole Miss punches this in, not only is the game and season over for Alabama, but a whole lot more.
Yeah, didn't quite work out so well for Dan. I mean, and another part of this media hype, and I'm giving these guys way too much sort of. I shouldn't even talk about these guys because they are just irrelevant. But they make a career out of talking about Alabama not being all that good because that stuff gets.
Because that's what people want to hear. Like when, first of all, the fact that Miami Notre Dame got out of hand, but then the fact that this game was close. I think wasn't Alabama this game the highest rated college football game on cable the whole season? Yep,
I saw that. Yeah.
Wow.
I guess it's brilliant, right?
People want to see Alabama lose,
right? And it's brilliant to write these articles about Alabama because everybody clicks them. The rest of the non-Alabama fans click it because they all want reason to believe that Alabama's going to lose, and the Alabama fans click it because obviously you're going to read that if you're an Alabama fan because we can't help ourselves but to indulge. So it's sort of a brilliant journalistic marketing strategy, whatever you want to call it. It doesn't make it any less crap, but it's wise, I guess is what I'm saying. So here's what I'm thinking for Mississippi State. We sort of just talked about how well Alabama played despite the narrative. Let's talk about the area in which Alabama. Let's start on defense because that was the part of this game that's getting talked about the most, right? Is Alabama's defensive performance here. So, and let's start with the rushing defense. Okay, what did we guys think? What did you guys think both of the defensive line play and the play of the linebacker, sort of separately, not looking at them in tandem, but looking at them separately?
Yeah, I mean, I think we all were. There was a lot of hand wringing about the push that Mississippi State got up front, and I saw a lot of people talking about like, oh, Alabama was getting blown off the ball. The defense, blah blah blah, whatever about the linebackers. The defensive line is playing terrible. The line actually played good. Like they were facing a really really good offensive line,
right?
And a really good running back and a really good running quarterback.
In a tough scheme.
Right. So the defensive line actually, like, they weren't all world, and they weren't good enough to make up for the fact that the linebackers were so compromised. Because it's easy to see a play where the O-line generates a little bit of initial push, and a guy and if Alabama's getting normal linebacker play, there's a gap that gets filled. And the play goes for maybe 2 yards. Like right. The guy gets beyond the line, but it's a quick stop. But that's a play that the linebacker normally makes. But when you watch it, and it can be hard to tell when just watching it, especially live, when it's sort of a linebacker that made the mistake initially. So you end up with a circumstance where the offensive line gets a little push, and the running back finds a hole because somebody didn't fill their gap. And you look at that and say, oh, the offensive line got blown off the ball and he found a crease. And it's like, well, what you're basically saying is the defensive line didn't blow up the play.
Right.
And therefore, they played horribly, which is just not what is the case sometimes.
Mitch, what do you think specifically about the defensive line performance?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the same thing. Just to back up Carter's point about like Mississippi State's offensive line, there's like, we like quoting advanced metrics here, but like Football Outsiders has like a handful of metrics they use to grade offensive lines, and they're like top 10 in almost every category, except like some random. No, yeah, they're top 10 in literally every category. So, yeah, I mean, we just got Deshaun Hand back from injury. Payne had a pretty good game.
I thought Payne had a really good game.
Yeah, I mean, as a whole, I didn't find too much to be disappointed in.
Who else on a sort of on the positive side of the ledger besides Payne, which is a weekly thing? Who else stood out to you as a positive performer?
Anthony Jennings had a few moments.
I thought he played well. He was a player of the week, right? He was a staff player of the week.
He was good. Bugs had some one on the final stop that they got when I guess it was on third down that they tried to run basically a delayed quarterback draw, and they faked a screen at first or like a swing pass to the running back at first, and then Fitzgerald took off, and by the time he was taking off, Bugs had driven his guy 3 yards into the backfield, and there was nowhere for Fitzgerald to go, and they all ended up gang tackling him. So He had a solid game, I thought.
And Bugs does that really well, right? I mean, Bugs does such a good job controlling his blocker and driving him back. He doesn't necessarily have sort of like the quickness or the quick twitch ability to like, shed his blocker immediately and get in the backfield and make like a great tackle for loss. But he is like a force up front in terms of controlling. He controls his gap really, really, really well. And I think that's sort of a great example of that. I thought Quinn Williams played really well too. I think he might have had probably the most splash plays of anyone on the defensive line, and he was just also like overall pretty solid. I don't know how many snaps he played. He probably only played in like maybe 30% of the defensive snaps, but I think him and Payne worked really well together up front at the two tackle positions. They ran some good TT twists together. Williams was just good on his own on a few plays. Like he was pretty good. What did you got? What about Hand in this game? Not very impactful, right? A little bit slow on the ball, maybe.
Yeah. It feels like he's still not at full speed.
Yeah.
Not that he was necessarily, making a lot
Before
of
the
splash
injury,
plays before the injury, but
yeah.
I don't know. It's kind of what we've seen from him all year, essentially.
So take this, just to wrap up the defensive line. Let's sort of take this out of 10 on a 1 to 10 scale, with 10 being, I don't know, 10 being what was an amazing Alabama defensive line performance that we saw maybe last year or something against the team. Alabama against
Pick any of them.
Alabama against anybody. Alabama. How about this? Alabama against USC. That was sort of the first game, and everybody was talking like, "Oh my God!" Like they're making guys like defensive linemen are getting in the backfield on every single play within like a second of the ball being snapped. It was just unbelievable to watch. So, okay, with 10 being Alabama against USC and 1 being, I don't know, 1 being a game where, you get rushed for 300 yards against you or something and you're just horrendous. What would you grade Alabama on that scale, their defensive line's performance against Mississippi State, keeping in mind what Mitch talked about, that Mississippi State's offensive line is really good?
7.5.
Yeah, I'd say I was gonna say 7 or 8. So
I was gonna say 7 or 8 too. So 7.5 is, I guess, we're all gonna fall in. Okay, so now they were a 7.5. That is good. That is good enough to win. It's not elite. Could this defensive line put together like a 9? Like, are they even capable of that against like a really good offensive line?
I haven't seen it yet.
Yeah, if they are, I don't think we've seen that.
I would say no also, and I think we'll come back to this later. It's not necessarily important now, but I think sort of setting that ceiling is important for when we revisit Auburn later, both in this podcast and in the subsequent podcast, just to sort of like cap their ceiling, because that's going to be important in terms of talking about what Alabama can do better against the run there. Linebackers. Linebackers, we're not going to have as many positive things to say about the linebackers. No. Anybody want to just start us off?
They just didn't look like, and like you can tell that whatever combination of his groin injuries basically take forever to heal, and that he hurt his ankle against LSU. It was obvious that Rashaan Evans was not full speed.
Yeah.
And also, Rashaan is not the kind of field general that a guy like Sean Deion Hamilton or even Reuben Foster is like. So I think he kind of needs good traditional middle linebacker play alongside him to really kind of unlock him as a player. So
I think more. I mean, he wants to Rashaan wants to shoot gaps. He wants to play fast. He wants
to be Reuben Foster in 2015 with Reggie Ragland.
Exactly. Right. And that's a real good comparison, I think, because you sort of saw Rashaan was being very, very aggressive and trying to do everything he can to shoot gaps and make splash plays and get to the running back real quick. And that is more effective when you have a more stable presence next to you.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, he didn't really have a stable presence next to him.
Nope. Did you? I mean, obviously, we've talked a lot since then about the performance of Keith Holcomb, and do want to acknowledge that he is apparently playing through an injury of his own, which makes some sense because, he hadn't been pressed into this role, and he was playing a much smaller thing, but he had generally been solid in this season. He hadn't had to play this role a lot, if at all, but he not been as bad as he was on Saturday. So an injury affecting his performance makes a certain amount of sense. But I don't know. Did you guys? I didn't necessarily pay attention as much to what Dylan Moses was doing when he was getting those snaps. Did you guys really have an impression of him?
Not much better from what I saw.
Less negatively. I don't think he played better than Holcomb. I think maybe just because of sort of context and the amount of snaps that Holcomb played versus the amount of snaps that Moses played. Holcomb, I think, had a far more negative impact on the game than Moses did, but I don't think that Moses played all that much better.
Yeah,
than Holcomb.
that's fair.
you know, so many words have been written and said about Keith Holcomb, and I don't want to harp on this too much. Also, Keith Holcomb is like such a nice guy too. I just
He's
want to
hilarious too.
I just want to say that like the games I've been to, like there was a number of times where like I waited outside the players' exit for everybody to come out, and like, I mean, this guy, he signed autographs for everybody. He was taking pictures with people. This was just like the nicest guy coming out. Like so I don't know. That's like,
Yeah.
I'm not trying to like soften the blow or anything. I'm not trying to like make this like into a character thing, but like he's like a super nice guy, and I'm like rooting so hard for him, and I'm happy for him that he's getting his shot. But we'd be remiss if we really sugarcoated this too much. He was not good.
Not good.
He was out of position a lot. He didn't fill the right gap a lot. He, you know, even at times where he was in position to make a play, he just didn't. You just saw him getting. He was hesitant, and he couldn't shed blocks like at all. It just is not the kind of performance we're used to seeing from an Alabama linebacker.
Right, Mitch. I know you texted us at one point and said something, I think, to the effect of that you watched Holcomb. You were really kind of keyed in on Holcomb for a lot of that game, right? And did you have any like specific impressions about?
Yeah, well, I noticed on the rewatch today, like 2 or 3 times early in the game, like he was looking at the sideline when the ball was snapped. Like calls were coming in. He's
calling the plays, right? They gave that duty to him and not to Rashawn, I think.
Right. Yeah.
So maybe there was an issue with getting calls in.
At least from what I saw early, I didn't see many angles later on in the game, but yeah, there were a few times where he's literally looking at the sideline, making a call as the ball's being snapped.
So that's something that can improve.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, I think Saban was asked after the game about the play of the inside linebackers, and he didn't have anything positive to say, really. He didn't answer the question specifically about how they played, so he ignored the question. And we can take a pretty good guess as to why he ignored the question. But he made a comment about how they got most of the plays incorrectly. So I think that relates very specifically to what Mitch is talking about, where clearly one of the, I think when he goes out of his way to say they got most of the plays incorrectly, that almost says to me
that
like
means
there was a problem getting
plays where we definitely didn't. Yeah, exactly.
Right. So I think that's a really good point, and hopefully that at the very least is something that gets cleaned up, right?
And that's probably not a responsibility he's had before.
No, I don't think.
Right?
No, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, look, he's not a guy that we're used to seeing at middle linebacker for Alabama. I mean,
it's been a while since they had anybody that limited. Nico Johnson was like, he was like, he was kind of limited in terms of his overall ability, but he was good within his role, right? Like, I think that's what you want from Holcomb. Like, if you can just get like a Nico Johnson-like performance, or even like a Trey DePriest-like performance, right? I mean, those are the things, like, because those guys, they didn't do a lot of things like spectacularly well, but their run fills were always really, really, really solid. And that's what you want.
I think Holcomb's perfectly capable of being that guy. It's just he got pressed into action off an injury against one of the toughest offenses they've faced all year, and it just, you got to get used to doing that. So, hoping that he gets a little healthier over the next 2 weeks, or week and a half, I guess, and that he gets comfortable doing that when they get him out there on Saturday against Mercer. Like, I think there's reason to be hopeful that he will get the hang of that.
Yeah, I think a lot, like, it's so one of the issues here, right, with trying to A, evaluate his performance, and B, project out future performance, is that we kind of know that he's hurt, but we don't know the extent of the injury. We don't know whether this is something that can possibly get better in the next week and a half before the Auburn game. But it's really hard to do that. One of the things that really concerned me the most, you guys talked about a lot of the things that he didn't do well. First of all, when he was in a position to make an open field tackle, he did not make the open field tackle. He didn't get off blocks. He played very passive. He just didn't really play well. He also didn't a lot of times seem to know where the ball was on these option plays. Like, it took him a long time to diagnose where the ball was and who actually had the ball. He's never like this year, how many times before this game did he even play on standard downs?
I mean, his role was basically the middle linebacker in dime, and I guess they lined him up at outside linebacker on some passing downs.
So this is never a situation that he's been in, right? He's never really even had to play the run. Right? He's only been in on passing situations. So that's really what concerns me the most. And obviously, like, if he's struggling to follow the ball on option plays, that is going to be a big issue against the team they play in 9 days.
Yep.
So anyways, we've said enough about this, and other people have said enough about this, and I don't want to sort of harp too much on the kid. He didn't play well. I think it's important to discuss why he didn't play well, because we at some point are going to talk about how he's going to play possibly in his next important game. But I think we've probably covered that enough. The secondary was kind of like
it wasn't their best game. They were mostly pretty good in coverage, I thought. The big issue was that they just didn't, like, particularly for Tony and Hootie, they just did not tackle well.
Right.
When they were sort of pressed into service on that front.
My perception of the secondary was that they played decently well. They just didn't make big plays.
Yeah.
Like, they had big plays out in front of them to be made, and they did not make those big plays. They busted deep on the first play of the game. Whatever. They're going to bust deep. Every secondary busts deep a couple times a game.
Happens.
But, like, there were just plays where they didn't make, right, like 3 third downs. One, Minka knocks the ball away, but Hootie I think gets called for with, like, a pretty egregious hold too.
Yeah, it was definitely the right call.
There was a play with Tony Brown where they had the coverage perfectly schemed. The ball's thrown a little, like, sort of in breaking route over the middle. Tony is right on the guy's hip, and he just doesn't make a play on the ball. I mean, he's right there, and he doesn't make a play on the ball. There was another play out of a bunch set, and Saban specifically mentioned that he didn't think that they defended the bunch sets well, but there was a play where Levi Wallace just fell down. That was a really, really bad play. I think that was the drive where Mississippi State got the field goal. Like, these are all third downs, and you got to make a play at some point. You know what I mean? You have to. Sometimes you just don't make the big plays, right? Sometimes there's games that go by and you just kind of consistently fail to, like, come up in the biggest spots. And I think that's kind of what happened, maybe a little bit. Like, there wasn't, like, receivers running free all over the place. There was a couple times where people were open. There was that 3rd and short where they got Ronnie in, like, a run pass conflict, and they had an easy shot over the middle to, I think maybe it was the tight end or something, but that was just, like, a great play call, perfectly executed. Teams are going to hit plays like that against you. Anthony Averett was good, right? I don't know if there was many balls completed against him.
Yeah, nothing that I recall.
So it was fine, I mean, it was fine. Like, they didn't their overall body of work, I think, is what I'm trying to say, was not bad.
Yeah.
Should we move to the offense?
Yeah. It was just such a weird game to evaluate for the offense, because Mississippi State had the ball so much in the first half and even in the third quarter, because they were dominating. They were staying on the field and sustaining drives, and then Alabama would get out there and score immediately. So I don't know. It's hard to say. I mean, they really put together 3 or 4 good drives in the second half, I thought. They had good solid drives on both touchdowns and on the field goal and on the missed field goal. And I think the best thing you can say is that and about them and about Jalen in particular, is that they came through when it mattered the most.
Right.
But it was such a weird game for the Alabama offense.
Yeah. Mitch, what did you think about the performance sort of overall?
Yeah. We talked about how efficient they were, just from kind of an advanced stats perspective. So even though they didn't have the ball, for a lot of the game, they kind of made up for it. I thought it was interesting. We tend to see, I don't know if we would talk specifics, but we tend to see the young guys at receiver, in these later kind of more important drives, but they never seem to be the ones to like start the game. Starting the game, it's always, Cam Sims
and Robert
and Ridley. But for some reason, it's like when that they need to go down and score, all the freshmen are getting in there. Is that like a blocking thing, do we think?
Maybe.
Yeah, I mean, Ben, you highlighted a play no, sorry, I saw this on a different film. I think it was the one that was up on RBR. There was one play where they faked a handoff inside and then ran a design run for Jalen to the outside, and it could have gotten a lot more. They had Irv Smith as a kind of working as a lead blocker basically, and it could have made a ton of yards, and he still got like 13 yards off because he broke a tackle. But Jerry Jeudy should have come in and blocked the corner, and then Irv Smith would have been leading around to get the safety. But Jeudy just ran forward and kind of, made good initial contact, but just sort of like slammed his shoulder into the corner and then kept going. And the corner was in, so Smith had to take him, and the safety had like a free shot on Jalen.
Well, and there was a play that I think I posted the pics on Twitter about this was Alabama's first drive of the second half. They got down inside the 10 on the long run by Damian Harris, and then on second down they threw like a quick smoke screen out to Ridley, and they had the numbers. They had 2 blockers against 2 defenders. And it was Jeudy, I think it was Jeudy and Devontae Smith, and they both of them tried to cut their man, and neither one of them succeeded in doing so. And the guys were just right there waiting for Calvin, and that could have been a touchdown if they secured both blocks. So I think, to Mitch's point, it's definitely, there is definitely a gap in terms of the blocking abilities of the group of receivers. I think Cam Sims in particular is a pretty good blocker.
And that's in part a size thing. Like, none of the freshman receivers are big guy. Like, Smith is real skinny. Ruggs is kind of on the short side. And I don't know, Jerry Jeudy's kind of built like Calvin is, I think. So certainly with, in particular with regard to Cam Sims, he's a huge dude, and none of the freshmen are anywhere near that size. But still, they need to be better at blocking than they are, regardless.
Right, but it's certainly sort of unfortunate, though, right? Because like the freshmen are way more of a receiving threat.
Oh yeah, they're incredibly dynamic.
So it's like you can't really have the best of both worlds here.
Yeah,
you can kind of only have one or the other. I
do think it's sort of odd that it really seems to be like, in some sets it's Calvin, Foster, and Sims, and in some it's Calvin and the freshmen. Like, you think they could mix and match.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Sims with some freshmen more.
And it's like full drives too, right? Don't they have this? They have this sort of tendency to give one group of receivers an entire drive instead of rotating them in and out based on like specific sets and plays and stuff. So that's sort of an interesting tactic too. Let's talk specifically about the receivers. It seemed that when the freshman group was on the field late, there really was no Ruggs. It was all Jeudy and Smith. What do you guys think of that? Is Ruggs clearly the third guy right now amongst the freshmen?
I kind of think so. it seems like, despite the fact that he has 5 touchdown catches on 6 total receptions,
yeah.
It definitely seems like he's getting the least total playing time of those guys.
Yeah.
Which is, because how many teams does your 6th wide receiver make a huge impact, right?
Yeah. I think we'll just stay on the receivers just for a second. Like, for Jalen to go to Devontae Smith there to win the game, I think that's just awesome.
Yeah.
I think that's awesome that he, like, it's obviously the passing game is very Calvin centric, as it should be, because Calvin is probably the best receiver.
Okay, that makes me. I do want to, just as an aside here for a second. I've seen some people talking this week in. I don't mean to get back to our hating on the Jalen haters, such as it is, but I've seen some people complaining this week that, he still locks on to Calvin. He still always wants to throw to Calvin. He should. But it's just like, when you have one, like, Calvin is the best player on the offense, period. And like, when you have one guy who's like both I don't know, the freshmen are pretty fast. So he's one of the fastest guys on the team. He's by far the best at getting open. He's the most explosive with the ball in his hands. You should design your offense such that that guy is getting the ball more often than everyone else. And when you're designing it to get to him and he's better at getting open, then of course a huge percentage of the offense is going to go to him. Like, I just don't. What a stupid thing to say, that like, wow, I wish we threw the ball to our best receiver.
Yeah. I don't doubt that, like, I guess that criticism, the more legitimate form of that criticism is couched in the idea that Jalen, like, Calvin will be Jalen's primary on the play, and when his primary isn't open, Calvin won't sort of go through his progressions. They won't go, to a second guy and his third guy as well. And that's true, right? That's true. A lot of he's not like great at going through his progressions.
No.
But I was thinking about this. I was thinking about this last night. Yeah. How many college quarterbacks are? Like, how many college quarterbacks are great at, like, my first, the timing they're going through 1, 2, 3 through your progressions. Yes, I would love it if Jalen was great at that. He's not great at that.
Right.
But, like, what does that mean? Yeah. What does it mean that he's not great at that? Does it mean that, like, he shouldn't be the quarterback? Does it mean that he's not their best option? Does it even mean that he's not a good college quarterback? I think the answer to all of those questions is no.
Right.
I think that he is a good. I think that Jalen is a legitimately good college quarterback. I don't have any qualms in saying that. I think he's very.
I think it's sort of like, I hadn't watched Georgia a ton this year, and it was striking to me watching, despite the fact that Fromm has put up solid passing numbers, for him, the passing plays they run for him, it's a lot like, there's not nearly as many screens or tap passes on jet sweeps, but it's kind of the same stuff that Alabama would run for jet. Like, he doesn't throw in the middle of the field, really.
Right.
It's occasional deep shots. It's fades to the outside.
The whims,
It's screen passes and check downs and stuff like that. He really does not, and unsurprisingly, because he's a true freshman that they did not expect to be the starter this season. Like, he doesn't throw kind of the full route tree the way Jalen, for instance, does now. Like, and even if he's not particularly advanced in doing that and going through his reads, like, one, he's still better than a large percentage of college quarterbacks, and two, like, I think it highlights how much progress he's made.
Is Jalen the best quarterback in the SEC?
I think when you factor in passing and running, yes.
I do too. I do. Mitch, what do you think?
I'm struggling to come up with somebody I would. Yeah, I don't.
I mean, Stidham's up there. Fitzgerald's up there.
I mean, that's it, right?
Yeah.
Now, okay, so obviously there aren't a lot of great quarterbacks.
Yeah. So, but yeah.
But like, I don't know, like he is a legitimate. Maybe he's not the best, but he has a legitimate claim to being the best in his conference. I don't know. So let's talk about how about the things that Jalen did well on Saturday, right? Like, first of all, he
How
made a
about
lot
on
of
the
plays.
second touchdown drive, that scrambling out of the pocket and throwing a deep bomb to Calvin over the defense?
Yeah,
That was
how
awesome.
about
We've complained before about how he doesn't throw well on the run, and just like over the course of like the past 5 or 6 games, it's like all of a sudden he can do that.
yeah, and the plays he made from the pocket, right? Like he made a lot. How about the so okay, a lot of talk about all the plays. He made some throws late against the blitz, so on and so forth. How about the throw on their first touchdown drive on like a 3rd and long, where he stood in the pocket and waited for Calvin to come free over the middle on like a deep square in route? I mean, that was a nice throw, right? Didn't he have a throw to he threw a ball stepping up in the pocket to Cam Sims coming over the middle? I don't know. He made a lot of great throws, and on the touchdown, that was just a great like Jalen. I don't know. I could be remembering this incorrectly, but I thought Jalen's numbers last year under pressure were horrendous.
Awful.
I thought he was just terrible, terrible, terrible under pressure. Well,
and early this year, there were people still being like, "Wow, bro, people are still doing all the same stuff about Alabama. Like, why can't he why can't we take care of the blitz? Like, why can't he make throws against the blitz?"
Well, yeah,
he made 2 of them on the last drive, and apparently that the 3rd and 15 one to Calvin, the people are saying that was an audible, that he audibled Calvin into that screen, and apparently Calvin didn't want to do it at first or something.
Really?
And Calvin, yeah, that was supposedly the story. The story I've heard is that Calvin audibled into that slant to Calvin.
Interesting. Yeah, and that would be interesting. And then on the touchdown, you got the guy coming free off the edge, which is Jalen's man. There's nobody there to pick him up, and Jalen sees him, and him and Devontae are on the same page. Like, this is like Jalen and a true freshman receiver nailing that sight adjust and hitting that backside slant, and that's impressive. Jalen is so patient under center. He does a really good job at kind of forcing the defense to declare their intentions before the snap. And then, he can put himself in a better position to succeed after the snap. He's not a great quarterback, but he's, improving each week. And I think that's really nice to see.
On one of it, I think it was on the 4th and 4 that he converted on, I guess it was the drive that tied the game. That one was one where Mississippi State lined up to blitz on that one from the right side of the offense.
Yeah.
This being Todd Grantham, of course. And what they ended up doing was they dropped both of those guys back at the snap, but then had them delay blitz around the right side. And so when they started to come around, Jalen has just looked off his first read, and he sees that they vacated that space, and they're coming around the right side. They're coming around the left side after him, and he sees that there's just green grass right there. So the gap is starting to collapse at that point. So he just decisively takes off, seeing all the space that's there, and gets the first down, which is we talked about wanting him to stay in the pocket, wanting him to go through his reads. But, like I said after LSU, you just want him to be decisive. And especially when like that, as good of a runner as he is, if they give you that space, take it, especially on a 4th down.
Yeah. Jalen has so much more success scrambling when he stays in the middle of the field than when he tries to leave the pocket, I feel like. So I'd almost like him to sort of try to really abandon that leave the pocket sort of strategy when the play breaks down, and instead take it through the middle, and if there's nothing there, then just fight your way back to the line of scrimmage instead of there was a couple plays that I saw where he left the pocket where I thought that there was an opportunity to run the ball through the middle. So I kind of when he does it, it typically goes really well. And I almost think he could afford to do it more. And I think that sort of dovetails with Carter's point about the thing that will suit Jalen the best going forward is decisive action one way or the other. So there's that from Jalen. What do we think about the running game here?
Um, it's hard to grade what they did in the first half because there just wasn't a whole
A
lot
lot
of
of
it.
opportunity, yeah.
In the second half, though, on a lot of those longer drives, they ran the ball real well.
I mean, they were dominant running the ball,
Yeah.
right? Um, a lot of the stuff was off tackle stuff,
Yeah,
right? Like,
they finally got Bo going off tackle, which is I think what you really want to see. I mean, he just seems to run better that way. I think with the fact that he doesn't have as good a vision as guys like Harris and Jacobs, and there were a couple of plays where if you go back and watch him where Josh Jacobs was running inside and his vision looked just as good. There was particularly one I remember where he just it was just a little inside zone play, and he made a really nice cut inside into a little gap that a lot of backs would not have seen, and got 8 yards out of what. Not to pile on Bo or anything, but a play that I don't think Bo would have gotten more than 3 or 4.
Yeah, and I thought, I don't know, they did such a good job, like, with this sort of horizontal running game, but then using that to set up the interior running game. That was really good. I think that they really are well suited to put Jacobs and Harris on the field together.
Yeah,
I think that's like I think those tend to be always like really, really, really effective sets for them, just because there's so many different things for the defense to have to account for. And like, there was a play that was the long, I think a couple people, Cole Kublik, Chris Brown from Smart Football, I think they both commented on the long Damian Harris run. Where just the action of Jacobs coming across on the jet motion,
well, yeah, because hadn't they just run a play where they handed it to Jacobs on the jet motion?
Right. So it holds the, so what it does is it moved the backside linebacker and held the backside safety. So you kind of put Harris in a situation where, as long as things were sort of blocked up initially, all he had to do was make one guy miss, and then he was going to get a big play. And Harris is really good in the open field at making that one guy miss, and he did that. So I think that's something that I'd like to see. We had sort of texted a little bit about this the other day. This seems like a overly simple kind of just general strategy, but maybe they are best kind of like giving Harris and Jacobs the bulk of the work in the first part of the game, and then when the defense is a little bit worn down, bring in Bo, because Bo is at his best.
Especially when you think about it, and not just a lot of people will turn that into sort of a simplistic thing, like, oh, Bo's so like big and powerful, and you want to kind of have the battering ram in the fourth quarter. But it's also Bo, like we were mentioning, Bo runs better outside, and so when you have guys like both trying to cover sideline to sideline and trying to tackle a guy as big and strong as Bo is, that's where you can on a tired defense. Like, if you're doing both those things at once, that's really gonna stress them.
Yeah, and Carter, you had specifically talked about the running game, about the sort of the different types of run plays, right? And you wanted to see more gap plays, and I think that's something we see. I think we sort of see this every week, where just Alabama is just better in gap schemes.
Yeah.
In part because like, zone blocking is tough, especially inside zone blocking. Like, you have to have such cohesion between your for each guy on the unit, and you have to have, like, I don't know. You look back at that 2012 team, right? I mean, they were so good in terms of on zone plays. You're kind of ad-libbing a little bit, right?
Yeah.
You're ad-libbing, like, okay, we double here, climb to the second level here. It's not man scheme, so you're kind of making it up as you go, and it's super effective if everybody's good and cohesive.
Right. There's a lot of guys just kind of have to, particularly on double teams, they kind of just have to feel when to engage on those and when the other guy's got it, and you can peel off and find a linebacker, which is something that a lot of guys don't do well.
Yeah. It's just hard. It's so hard. And if you look at, like, Alabama's situation specifically this year, Lesser Cotton is so much better in man and gap schemes. I mean, he is so athletic. You get him kind of kicking out on somebody, pulling around. Like, he's really, really, really good at that. Even J.C. Hassenauer had some good blocks when they kind of pulled him around.
That was one of the real positives for me. Was, obviously you don't want to lose a starting offensive lineman. I thought Hassenauer was great in relief of Ross Pierce-Baker.
Yeah. So, I think that's really something that I want to see going forward. That's not to say that you just sort of throw all of the zone schemes out the window, but this is
and a lot of those plays where they got Bo going, those were just outside zone stretch plays.
Yeah. Well, they did a really good job just schematically, I think, in the second half of the game, outflanking Mississippi State. Those were probably some sort of formation adjustments that they made as the game went on to find ways to outflank them. And the truth is that if you have a defense outflanked, a lot of times you don't even want to mess around with pulling guards and stuff like that. You have them outflanked, just run the outside zone stretch play, get out in front, leverage your opponent back toward the middle of the field, and get to the edge. Like, it gets kind of simple, right, when you've got the defense outflanked. But if you don't have the defense outflanked, I think the gap schemes are this offensive line is just much better. That's just a much better fit for them. So that's kind of something that we've been talking about for a while, for years now, with this offensive line. Maybe, I don't know, since the show started, so 3 years ago. They're just better in those sets. So anything else about the offense generally?
I don't think so.
Okay. We want to kind of talk playoffs a little bit. I don't want to. So the main Auburn preview is going to be our show next week. I think we're going to do that on Monday. Is that correct? Okay. I don't, just, for reasons of not wanting to spread bad juju, I don't want to really discuss what happens if Alabama loses that game scenarios as it relates to the playoffs. So maybe
I've put a lot of thought of that into this point, and I'm sort of tired of thinking about it. Because,
So let's kind of get it out of the way right now, maybe. Just kind of like, if Alabama loses to Auburn, what are their chances of being in the playoff?
Not great, but the chance exists. Like, they need to root for a number. Like, they just need as many upsets, and they need as many 2-loss teams as possible.
Let's do this. Let's do this. Let's talk about what we think is most likely to happen in each conference. Say if that gets Alabama in, and if that doesn't get Alabama in, what then would need to change to get Alabama in? So what do we think happens? Let's start with the Big 12. What do we think happens in the Big 12?
Most likely scenario is Oklahoma wins out and is Big 12 champion at 12-1.
And they are definitely in. It honestly doesn't even matter what anybody else does. That Oklahoma team is definitely in. Now, what happens in the Pac-12?
Probably it's either USC or Washington. Probably.
And it really doesn't matter, because I think that we all agree, from Alabama's perspective, that an 11-1 Alabama should be in over an 11-2 Pac-12 champ.
Yep.
Okay. So those two conferences are kind of out of the way. We've got one team in. Between those two conferences, we've got one team in, Oklahoma. I think it's very likely that Oklahoma probably wins out. They seem demonstrably better than TCU. I think they'll probably find a way.
If TCU beats Oklahoma, I think that helps a lot, because I don't necessarily think 2-loss TCU is a for sure thing to go over.
Right. But we think that Oklahoma probably wins. So let's go from there. So we've got them in. In the SEC, we have. Then you have an Auburn-Georgia game.
Yeah.
Now we all kind of like Auburn in this game, right?
Yeah, I mean,
It's hard to not pick that after what happened.
Right, and probably Georgia won't play as poorly as they did in that game, but it's even if they play better, it's hard to see them then pulling that off.
So Auburn's in at 11-2. They join Oklahoma. Georgia then is also 11-2.
Yep.
Their second loss coming from an extra game.
Yeah. So ESPN, the ESPN Stats and Info account was tweeting earlier that they had people tweet them questions about like, so the ESPN does this strength of record metric, which is basically a sort of a resume tool, like performance adjusted resume, essentially something like that. So they were having people tweet at them. It's like, if this happens, like, what are the chances that X teams will have a top 4 strength of record? And over the last 3 years, strength of record has correlated really well with the playoff rankings. So that's the reason for doing that. They seem to think that an 11-2 Georgia, they say, basically my takeaway from looking at the stats is that they think an 11-2 Georgia would have a better strength of record than Alabama, basically as a result of having a good out-of-conference win, maybe not as good as we once thought it would be, and of having played an extra game, basically. I do think that might be a scenario where the committee wouldn't necessarily follow strength of record. Because how likely is it that if there's a spot for Alabama, or if it's down to Alabama or Georgia?
I feel like it would be Alabama.
Right. How likely are they going to put a Georgia team in to potentially
lost to Auburn twice?
They would be, they would be in the 4th spot almost. So like, why would they potentially set up a third game? But like, I just don't think
they would have to move up after a loss. Essentially, they would have to gain standings after losing.
That's true. Where were they in the playoff? Where were they in?
They were 6th or something.
7th.
I don't even think they were top 6. Yeah, I don't even think they were top 6. So they would. Yeah, so that's a
they'd have to move up after a loss, basically.
Yeah. So okay. So I think we feel pretty good about that not happening. It's clear, and if it actually comes down to this, it's clear that the committee has kind of soured on Georgia. They clearly didn't see that as just a loss. They saw that as a reflection of some deeper flaws that this team has that should bode well for a situation in which Alabama is 11-1 and competing for a spot against an 11-2 Georgia team. So now if the reverse happens and Georgia beats Auburn in the SEC championship, there's no way that a 3-loss Auburn team, despite having the head-to-head win against Alabama, would go over Alabama. So either way, we should probably be good no matter what happens in the SEC final. So now you've got 2 teams in. So you've got Oklahoma in, and you've got an SEC team in.
Yep.
What?
We almost certainly are going to get an ACC team in, unless Clemson loses to South Carolina.
Which could happen. That would not. That would. I don't. Certainly would not predict it, but that wouldn't shock me. That is in Columbia, right?
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. Not predicting it, but wouldn't be like totally.
It's definitely not like out of the realm of possibility the way you would say it probably had. Even though there was, I forget whether it was last year or the year before where that game was closer than expected, but like there's much more of a real chance of that this year. Especially with the way, one, South Carolina is just better than they've been the last couple of years, and 2, the way, I mean, Clemson's offense is way worse, and they just they've played a lot of sort of close, kind of struggly games that they then kind of pulled away at the end, or games like Auburn where they kind of scored when they needed to and then quit trying. So that's a possibility. I would say the most likely I don't even know who I favor at this point between Clemson and Miami. Yeah. But your likely matchup is Miami and you're going to have Miami and Clemson probably at 11-0 and 12 or 11-1.
Right.
And I think what you want, I don't even know which
one. You want Miami.
Right? I don't know which one I think is more likely, but the one you want is Miami, because there is some chance the committee could say 11-1 or 11-1 Miami is better. 11-1 ACC runner-up Miami is better than 11-1.
You put both ACC and then you put both ACC teams in. Okay.
Right.
So let's Let's go to
two-loss But if Miami wins that game and Miami's 12-0 because Miami had a game canceled, so they would be 12-0 and undefeated. If Miami wins that game, I don't think two-loss non-champion Clemson has any chance.
Especially because they lost to Syracuse, which I guess this is something that we're going to touch on in a minute.
Which apparently the committee does not see as a bad thing at all. But it's just like two-loss non-conference champion, no chance.
Okay.
It's just not happening.
So now, probably the most interesting situation is in the Big Ten. In the Big Ten, is the title game set already?
No.
No, there is a like if
How does this not? How does
I
it
think
not end up?
Wisconsin's already in.
Wisconsin's already in.
How does Ohio State end up not in?
I think if Michigan beats them, aren't they in?
Because they only have one conference loss. They hold the tiebreaker.
So, but there would be a weird.
There would be like 3 or 4 at like 2 losses in that division.
Yeah, it would be a weird tiebreaker scenario.
Because you've got Michigan State at 2 losses. You've got Penn State at 2 losses. You've got how many losses does Michigan have in the conference? They lost to Penn State. They lost to Michigan State. So they only have 2. Also weird. That's weird.
They would have 4. They would have 4 2-loss teams.
Oh man, that's a mess. Yeah, so who knows there? If Ohio State beats Michigan, there. Well,
but that's what we want, right? Because we want Ohio State in that game to beat Wisconsin because we like their chances to beat Wisconsin best, and we want Wisconsin to lose.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So the most likely scenario in the Big Ten is that Ohio State wins the conference. They're an 11-2 champ.
Yeah.
Now, that would leave Wisconsin at either a 12-1 non-champ or, depending on what they do against Michigan, 11-2.
Yeah.
So let's tackle this from a couple different angles. 11-2 Ohio State, conference champion, wins at home against Michigan State and Penn State, and a road win against Michigan, conference title win against Wisconsin, losses decisively at home against a really good playoff-bound Oklahoma team, and very, very, very decisively on the road against a, I don't know, top what kind of team is Iowa? Top 30 team? Roughly. Okay. So like a kind of like a roughly top 30 team in which they got destroyed. Let's take that head-to-head first. Alabama or Ohio State. Also, let's assume one thing really quick. I want to throw one thing out there. I think that there's like a 5% chance that Auburn beats Alabama decisively, but let's just, for the sake of argument, say that doesn't happen. It changes if Auburn goes in there and whoops Alabama in the Iron Bowl. But in all likelihood, if Alabama loses this game, it's probably going to be a close game. So let's just say, for argument's sake, that it is a close game. So it's a close loss.
Yeah.
So, okay, so continue.
It's just like there's just it's hard to say how the committee would evaluate that, right? Because
what is Ohio State right now?
8, I think.
Are they still behind Georgia?
Yes.
Okay.
They better still be behind Georgia.
Yeah, they're behind Notre Dame.
Because in case we haven't already mentioned it, they lost by 30 to Iowa.
Yeah, like some of the traditional ways of thinking about what the committee's done, that they tend to favor good wins over bad losses, which is true. And that Ohio State would have more good wins than Alabama would have, certainly true. But it's just like, man, how are you going to put in a team that has lost twice decisively, and in one of those, not just like they've forgiven losses to bad teams before. Obviously,
if it's your only loss, but for them, this was their second loss.
This was their second loss, and it wasn't just that they lost to a bad, like Ohio State in 2014 lost to a bad Virginia Tech, Clemson lost to a bad Pitt last year. Like, teams have survived bad losses. Oklahoma in 2015 against Texas, but they got blown out.
Right. And there's no excuse here.
Right.
Like the committee loves their injury excuses. Like they talked about the Kelly Bryant thing. We can debate the merits of that another time. But in this case, there was nothing weird going on with Ohio State. They were coming off their best win of the year against Penn State.
In the first half, but that's like you're not going to convince me that one defense, especially as deep as Ohio State defensive line is, you're not going to convince me that the loss of one defensive lineman even makes the game noticeably closer, let alone makes a difference in the
Right.
outcome.
Right. So I don't know. Like, I would really think that should be Alabama. I honestly believe that.
I really do. I just don't, like. I think if you have lost twice by at least 2 scores, one of those is getting blown out by a decent at best team. Like, I just don't. I think you've blown your chance. I just
And
think. And for what it's worth, we talked about the ESPN stats and info thing. They projected as Ohio State having basically no chance of having a top 4 strength record.
Okay. Now let's say Wisconsin loses 12-1 non-champ. Their best wins are home Michigan. What's their best win? Home Michigan. Okay.
Yeah.
Any chance for that team? What is okay.
I don't think 12-1, and the committee has all year hated on Wisconsin for how terrible their schedule was.
What?
So I like, if all that gets better from here on out is that they beat a okay Michigan team, that I don't see it happening.
What about 12-1 conference champion?
So that's so funny. Right before you joined the call, Carter and I were talking about that exact situation. Yeah, that's a very good question. I would be worried about that.
Yeah, I would too.
Okay. But we're gonna trust Ohio State, right? Like,
Yeah. Well, here's the thing. We're rooting for Wisconsin against Michigan regardless, just because we would be scared about 12-1.
Wait, aren't we rooting for?
They play Michigan this week.
Wait, are we rooting for Wisconsin against Michigan?
I don't think it matters, honestly, because I think you root for Michigan, right? Because Alabama has, at least, if Wisconsin wins the conference, Alabama at least has a shot of getting in.
Yeah.
Even if
they're 12-1, if it's
over
12-1
Wisconsin,
right.
But has no shot of getting in over 13-0 Wisconsin.
Right. Yeah. And it doesn't do us any good for Wisconsin to win the game.
And if if Wisconsin loses, that diminishes the quality of the win for Ohio State and the chance that Ohio State.
Yeah, sorry, I was thinking about Ohio State, Michigan. Yeah.
So then in this situation, going with what we said, Oklahoma wins out. The SEC gets a team because whoever wins the SEC championship gets a team. Let's say Miami wins out, okay, and beats Clemson, and let's say Ohio State wins out. Does Alabama get in? Yes or no? What's most likely?
So it's basically down to
Alabama versus
theoretically an 11-2 Pac-12 champion, 11-2 Big Ten champion Ohio State, and 11-1 Alabama.
And maybe a 11-2 Georgia, I guess, because maybe they're still a factor.
Yeah, technically so.
10-2 Notre Dame is not a factor anymore. We don't really think 11-2 Clemson is a factor anymore. So that's the matchup.
Yeah.
Does that
I think the chances are pretty good. I think they're probably, like, no question going to be above the Pac-12 champion, and it's just a question of whether the committee values the Ohio State having wins over Penn State. It's almost even independent of Alabama, really. It's just a question of how the committee views Ohio State, with them having a pretty solid collection of wins, but to really, like, and the Oklahoma loss is not really bad, but like a definitive loss to a great team, and a terrible loss to an okay.
Right. Now, what happens? What do we think if Clemson wins out?
And Miami's one loss.
Yeah.
Yeah. I just like,
because now you've got Miami into the mix right now.
Miami would
is
have a better
single
win than Alabama has, but I mean, what's their next best win? Like,
what's their best? Their best win in this is what? Their best win is home
Notre Dame.
Notre Dame.
Notre Dame.
Yeah.
It might not hurt for us to root for Stanford to beat Notre Dame.
Yeah.
Or even maybe like if the more the Notre Dame win is devalued, that helps Alabama a lot.
Yeah.
But I just like they've been so like they were pretty good. They were good against a solid Virginia Tech team, which I don't really know why people think this Virginia Tech team is that good, but like apparently they do. So they have that one, and they have a win that looks great against Notre Dame. Beyond that, they struggled with. They almost lost to North Carolina.
Yeah.
They frankly should have lost to Florida State.
In those,
At least you have a common opponent. You have a common opponent.
Yeah.
That Alabama dominated when they were at full strength.
When they actually had
Miami almost lost to
with Blackman at quarterback.
Yeah.
Yeah. So now, if we're trying to be as objective as possible, regardless of what we think the committee will do we think Alabama deserves to be in?
The case is not as strong as it's been as it would have been the last couple years, just on Alabama alone. I do think when you like, I don't know. My thinking on this is if the committee is giving Clemson a free pass, right? And they absolutely are. Like, Syracuse is a bad team. And like, I don't care if your quarterback went down, you shouldn't lose to Syracuse if you're a top 4 team. The committee is giving them a total pass on that. Well, why shouldn't Alabama have? You know, it's one thing if you lose a bunch of guys and they're never coming back, but like Alabama's now, there's a very good chance they have the 2 outside linebackers they've been missing all season, and they would have Mac Wilson back by playoff time. And all the guys that have been playing hurt throughout the year should be basically fully healthy by that time. Why shouldn't Alabama get that same benefit of the doubt?
Yeah.
Did they talk about on the show how much of a gap there is between like Alabama and everybody else?
I did not watch the show.
Okay, I didn't either.
I turned over to see the rankings, but then I flipped back to watch the Colin Sexton show.
Yes. We had it.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead, Mitch.
Well, I mean, they've talked every week about how there was a gap. I mean, when it was Georgia and Alabama, just a gap between 2 and the rest of the field. I mean, I just feel like I don't know deserve. I don't. Depends on how you want to define deserve, but like when Alabama, and especially if Auburn goes on to beat Georgia, when your only loss is to another playoff team on the road.
Exactly.
Like, why should Alabama drop that far?
Yeah, and right, exactly, with the buffer that they would have already had, like, so really drop them down.
And I think I
certainly think they deserve to be in over an Ohio State. To me, if you've been blown out twice, once by a team as bad as Iowa, you should not be in the playoff.
Yeah, it should be disqualifying.
I would say the same thing for USC too.
Yeah,
they got destroyed by Notre Dame.
Yeah, I don't think. Look, we've talked about this a lot, and we talked about it on social media, and we talked about it before the show, but like, Alabama just does not get credit for the fact that doesn't happen to them. It never happens to them, ever.
They never get blown out, and they never lose to mediocre teams.
Ever. Their worst loss this decade, we went through this before the show, their worst loss this decade was to South Carolina in 2010.
27 years ago.
And South Carolina was a fringe top 20 team. I think they were ranked 20 when they beat Alabama. That was probably pretty appropriate ranking. They're a fringe top 20 team. That is their worst loss.
They were number 8 at the end of the year, S&P Plus. South Carolina was.
There you go. So I'm not even going to give them credit. I'm not even going to take that. I'm not even going to call them the top 10. But like that, so that's their worst loss. And it's actually, not only is it their worst loss, but it's their worst loss probably by a pretty considerable margin. Like their second worst.
Well, you consider the fact that that's one of 3 games they've lost in the last decade by by 14 points. Their three
Right.
biggest losses of the last decade are that, Utah, and
Oklahoma
in the Sugar Bowl.
Yeah. Yeah, and you know, that Oklahoma team in the Sugar Bowl, that is probably the second worst team that Alabama's lost to. That or 2014 Ole Miss, and 2014 Ole Miss was pretty damn good when Alabama played them,
Yeah.
but better than the finished product. So like, and all their other losses are against like solidly top 10 teams, and a lot of top 5 teams.
Yep.
You know, so it is really hard. And this is proven to us year after year. When playoff teams, the best teams in the country, lose at least one game that they shouldn't have lost. Clemson, the national champion last year, lost at home to Pittsburgh. They
and
lost
should have lost at home to a bad NC State team.
Right.
Alabama fans, like, don't let yourself do this because it will drive you. It will drive you to madness. But think about the fact that if NC State's kicker just makes like a 30-yard field goal at the end of regulation in that game, then Alabama never has to see Clemson in the playoff and is almost certainly the national champion last year.
Yeah, in that situation, Alabama's probably facing Penn State in the semifinal, and they're going to roll them. And then they're facing the winner of Ohio State against Washington, which probably means that it's Alabama against a very limited Ohio State offense in the national championship, and it's not even remotely close. So, yeah, you know, so like Clemson, they won the national championship. They lost to that team. 2014, Ohio State won the national championship. They lost to Virginia Tech by multiple scores.
They lost to
the Oklahoma 2015 lost to Texas. Michigan State 2015 lost to Nebraska. This just goes on and on. Washington last year got smoked at home by USC. Alabama never
2013 Auburn got blown out
by LSU. This never happens to Alabama, never. So, like, clearly, right? Clearly, it's hard. It's hard to always beat those teams, always, every time. And Alabama does it every time.
Yeah.
But there's no credit. Everybody just looks at their resume and they go like, well, where's your top 10 win? Where's your top 5 win? Well, okay, they might not have any this year, but that's not the only thing that matters when it comes to resume. And, you know, we've talked a lot on this podcast about eye test, right? And measuring quality of play and using that to rank teams. Well, we're not even asking for that in this situation. We're asking for a simple results-based analysis. The results-based analysis that shows that Alabama never loses.
Think about how many teams they beat that may have ended up top 10 teams otherwise, too. Like,
right. They never even lose to good teams, let alone mediocre teams, or let alone average teams, bad teams, whatever. Like, they never even lose
the Mississippi State team that Alabama thoroughly outplayed on Saturday and should have beat by more, that they came away with a tough road win against, is a million times better than the incredibly mediocre, the okay at best Iowa team that Ohio State got blown out by.
If Alabama had that
Iowa team, and okay, Wisconsin is fine. They have a very good defense. That Iowa team managed 66 yards of total offense against Wisconsin last week. 66 yards.
And consider this. We just talked about the fact that Mississippi State is a good team and Starkville is a tough place to play and so on and so forth. But if Alabama had lost that game, that would have probably been Alabama's worst loss since 2008, maybe second worst, depending on how you see them versus South Carolina. But like that's how good Alabama's been in these games. That actually would have been their worst loss, despite the fact that it wouldn't have overall been that bad a loss. It would have been their worst loss in 10 years. But they didn't lose because they never lose. They never lose those games, and they never get credit for it. In fact, not only don't they get credit for it, but people use the fact that it was a close game as an opportunity to write articles about how not so good Alabama is.
Yeah.
It's the opposite. It has the opposite effect. Not only don't they get credit for it, they get disparaged for playing one close game.
But it's never like Ohio State made the playoff last year with a loss, and they I mean, they played a 17-16 game against a terrible Michigan State team.
Yeah.
And the story coming out of that game, as it always is with that game, except for this year, is that like, well, Michigan State just plays Ohio State tough.
Clemson, as recently as the ACC championship last year, beat Virginia Tech on a game that came down to the final possession on a neutral site. Not such a great
year
Virginia
before
Tech.
that, it was the same story against North Carolina in the ACC championship.
Nobody talks about that. I don't remember any articles about how Clemson was leaking oil or whatever.
Clemson had a ton of struggle wins last year.
The year before, South Carolina played Clemson close. The last game of the regular season, that was a terrible South Carolina team. A South Carolina team that had just fired their head coach, or was gonna fire their interim head coach, whoever the head coach was for that was replacing Spurrier.
They had the interim coach after Spurrier resigned.
Right. The interim guy after Spurrier, like that guy almost kind of came kind of close to beating Clemson. So I don't know. But it's just never made a big deal of when it's other teams, and it just seems to be made a big deal of when it's Alabama. And that creates this narrative where Alabama doesn't really get credit necessarily for the things that they deserve to get credit for.
Yeah.
And that's the argument, right? Like, if these things happen and Alabama goes 11-1, Alabama should be in. Alabama should be in over Ohio State. They should be in over USC. They should be in over those teams because they did not slip up in the same way that those teams slipped up then. That's my argument, at least.
Yeah.
Anyway, let's stop talking about this because hopefully it doesn't matter at all.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess that's probably, should we just save Auburn completely for next week? I guess we've kind of ran kind of late on this. So
let's go ahead and do that since we're going to devote a whole show to them anyway. So
yes, okay. So want to wrap us up?
Yeah, I guess we're not going to do score predictions for this weekend, are we?
Oh God. What's the line? Is there like no line?
There might not be a line. A lot of times there isn't for
could have been interesting to do.
There's not a line.
Okay, so no line. Noon game. I don't know. I mean, Alabama's going to sit out a lot of guys. I don't think Minka's going to play, right? He hasn't practiced all week.
Shouldn't. Frankly, I think they should sit Rashawn too.
Yeah. I would love to say sit like Keith Holcomb or whatever, but I think Keith Holcomb has to play.
Holcomb has to have the reps.
It's right. It's important for him to like rep his run fits in an actual game. You play the guys that you have to play, and that's it. So we'll see. I don't know. Alabama will win.
Yeah.
Mercer's not 1A, right? They're double A.
They're
FCS, and they just started their program back like 5 years ago.
Oh, okay. Well, that should be a very interesting.
They played Auburn earlier this year. That was Auburn, one of Auburn's early cupcake games, and it was like 24 to 10.
Yeah, it was 24 to 10.
Although like Auburn had like 5 turnovers in that game, so
yeah.
And that was before Auburn wasn't playing nearly as well as they are now, just generally.
Yeah. This is kind of a weak slate this week, right? Like Michigan, Wisconsin is like the best.
The best game is Michigan, Wisconsin. There's basically nothing after the 11 a.m. time slot.
Yeah. Which just really quick before we wrap up, if you guys had to pick a playoff contender to lose this week, who do you pick?
Like, do we want to lose or that?
Besides, no. Prediction. Oh. Besides Wisconsin, because I think Wisconsin would be all of our picks, right?
Miami plays Virginia. That's not they will be heavily favored in it, but like Virginia has been decent at times this year. They could lose that game. It's unlikely.
Yeah.
So I don't even know if like Ohio State plays Illinois, which is basically so bad they're basically a mediocre FCS team per like the Sagarin ratings.
Oklahoma plays at Kansas.
Clemson plays the Citadel. That's not happening.
Georgia at home against Kentucky.
Yeah.
21.5-point favorites. Could we see that being a somewhat competitive game? Okay.
Kentucky is worse than their record.
Yeah. So I guess Miami. If Miami was at Virginia, that could be potentially a compelling game. Like let down, coming off a huge win.
Yeah.
But
and
being at
Miami
home,
played plenty immediate. Like I said, they had a 1-point win over an okay Georgia Tech team. They won by like 5 against an awful UNC.
Yeah.
So like if they're not playing their best, they absolutely could lose.
So that would probably be, that would be my game too. See them
Yeah.
lay an egg. But probably not much is going to happen to shake things up this week. Wisconsin could lose, but other than that, Wisconsin would be big, right? Because they really probably need to win this game. They probably need to go 13-0 in order to really have a case.
Yeah.
So that's really the one kind of big game, and that is a noon start. So it's kind of unfortunate for the only big game of the week, but we'll see. Okay.
All right. Well, roll tide, and we'll see y'all on Monday.
Roll Tide.
Roll Tide.